I put this scripture in the whole Jesus is a jerk category. We've got a few of them in the gospel. One is the Syrophoenician woman, where he says, well, I didn't come for you. And she says, even the dogs get to have the crumbs from the master's table. And Jesus has to kind of walk it back and say, yeah, you're right. Your faith is impressive. You'll get what you need. Another one is when Jesus is 13. Now, I don't know about you, but I got teenagers that age. And 13 is a particularly mouthy age, right across. So imagine Jesus, mom thought he was with dad thought he was with mom. He was actually back in the temple. And when they arrive, his response is, well, you should have known where I was. Jerk. My kid would not get away with that, but we don't know what happened to Jesus. I can't imagine his parents were convinced. Anyway, the thing with Jesus as a jerk, and I saw a few ripples through people when I said that, is that Jesus was human. And one of the biggest fallacies of the church, the oldest fallacies, is the belief that Jesus wasn't fully human. And we do that to Jesus when we take away his times of anger, his times of being a jerk, his times of being mouthy, his times of not getting it, because Jesus was a human being. And when we only look at the Jesus who is nice and friendly and loving and kind, we miss a lot of the point. Because Jesus was not always a teddy bear. He didn't always have kids climbing on his lap or having people that were needing to be helped and he was there. Sometimes he had some really hard things to say. That's hence the Jesus is a jerk series of scriptures. And the thing is, though, if you break it down a little bit, was Jesus really a jerk or was he just tired? Because I don't know about you, but when I'm planning an event, when it's kind of where my focus is, I don't have time for people to say, oh, but have you thought about this? No, I don't care about whatever you think is important. I got a job to do. And that's where Jesus was. He'd already spent his time in Galilee, making friends, going to parties, turning water into wine, spending time fishing. He'd done that part. Now he was heading to Jerusalem for a very strict purpose. He wasn't having fun anymore. This is rubber hits the road time. We kind of know where the story goes after that. But we'll walk it anyway, every year, multiple times, because at this point in time, Jesus has no time left over for distractions. And some of the distractions he's given, they pull on us from an emotional level. Well, let me just go bury my father, my dear father. And Jesus says, let the dead deal with the dead. I got something to do. It sounds very harsh, but it's not. Because Jesus had to get on with the show. And the thing about our Christianity is it's extremely simple, but it's very hard. And it's easy and simple are often words that are mistaken for each other, but they're not. They're not the same thing at all. It's so simple to be a Christian. Love God, love ourselves, love each other. That's all we're asked to do. Easy peasy. Except it's some of the hardest things we have to do. And Jesus knew that. But Jesus was not taking time out. He wasn't having the distractions that life brought along to these folks. He had to get on with the show. And these are not the disciples that he already had for the last 3 years that he was talking to. He wasn't being cruel to Mary or John or Peter or any of those people. Jesus was basically like rock star by this time. He'd been traveling all over the place, doing these miracles, getting all this attention. People knew the name, and they wanted to be associated with him. But Jesus knew that association was not going to be easy. So when they said, yeah, just let me get this in order and I'll be there with you, you could see their commitment's not really there. And Jesus didn't have time for that any longer. He had a job to do. And it's the same job that all of us have to do. There's no longer a living, breathing, physical person that we can follow. We're not asked to go to Jerusalem and follow Jesus there. We don't have that. We do have, however, a resurrected Christ who through the Holy Spirit is in us in every place and in every time. And that's what we're supposed to keep our eye on. So we don't have to leave town to do ministry. Some people do, and that's perfectly fine. But a lot of people don't. You can do ministry here. You don't have to wait till the house is paid off to have the money to go and do something. You can do it right now. You don't have to wait till the kids have graduated or they're having their second child so they actually kind of figured out this whole parenting thing. You don't have to wait for that. Because Jesus did not want us to wait. He didn't ask for us to be at the good time. Because let's face it, there's never going to be a good time to do ministry. Ever. I do this professionally, trust me. There's no good time to do this. Because you're called to leave family behind, and you're called to leave the things that life says are important off to the side. But the thing is, when you're called to follow Jesus, called to be a disciple, you can do it from your seat here, from where you're going to be in half an hour, where you're going to be this coming week. It doesn't matter. Because the needs of God are so prevalent. They're everywhere. Is there a child in town who really wants to go to camp and can't afford it? You can kind of ask the guides or scouts or church people, how do I support that? That is the action of being God and following the disciples today. Is there someone who needs special care? Is there someone whose heart is broken and just needs to be listened to tell the same story for the 30th time? They need you to be Jesus to them today. They need you to be the disciples to them today. Do you have a neighbor who doesn't have something they need? Do you have people in town that need to get to work and the car doesn't have enough gas and they're worried about that? See, the easy thing about the gospel is that we know we're supposed to help people. The hard thing about it is the how. How are we supposed to be the people that Christ calls to be disciples? How do you ask someone who you're pretty sure is struggling financially, do you need my help? Because there's a whole lot of ego around that question. People who don't want to share that they're broken and need something. How do you look at a town or community? I mean, my Dalhousie, kind of like this Dalhousie, community is shrinking. It's not what it was when I was a child there. How do you look around town and say we're still vital, we still matter, there's still enough of us here to be the living hands and feet of Christ to each other? How do you do that when there's more empty spots than full ones? Especially when we live in a world that is dedicated to telling us that we don't matter, that Christianity doesn't matter, that we're hate mongers, that we're fear mongers, that we're nasty, despicable people. How do we live in a world that tells us that Jesus wasn't the Spirit, that wasn't the Messiah that we follow? We have each other, is how we do that. We read the gospel is how we do that. And we remember that we had a leader who was more persecuted than any of us can imagine. And the message of that is enough to drive people to where they need to be. And this month, everybody has been celebrating Pride. And I've got quite a few people who are friends in the gay, trans, queer community. People who are completely comfortable in who they are, and people who are still completely scared of walking down the street. How do we be Christian to them? How do we recognize that they're Christian too? Their lives, their calling, their loves, who they are, does not separate them from Jesus one iota. They need to have friends and know that those of us who are in the church are not against them, because that's not a message that society wants them to know. Murdered and missing Indigenous women. I woke up, the very first news I read this morning is yet another woman in Calgary has been killed because she fought back against the police. And one of the very first lines someone had responded, bet he was trying to rape her and she was fighting for herself. Chances are, that's an opinion, there's no proof that we know of that, but chances are these women live perilous existences simply because of who they are. The color of their skin, their ethnicity. How do we, as Christians, respond? Especially when so many are getting caught up in the, oh, we can't call it genocide. Oh, how dare we say any of those heavy, dark words. It is genocide. And Jesus dealt with genocide. And he called people to stand up in a world where people were not sure what to do because they never knew if they were next. We don't have that fear. Especially those of us who represent the privileged majority, white, English, heterosexual. I'm not making assumptions, I'm just saying what I see. We don't have to worry about people attacking us for our mere existence. So we have the responsibility and the privilege to stand up and say injustice is not acceptable. Kids in cages are not acceptable. Separating families are not acceptable. Murdered women are not acceptable. Because you know what? We're following the guy who said it first. When Jesus spoke 2,000 years ago, he was revolutionary. He was revolutionary because his one message was, you matter. In a Roman society that was always telling people that they weren't worth anything, Jesus stood up and said, you matter. And you know what? Who cares if he had to be a jerk about it? The message had to get through. And that's the message we are now called. Everybody you see this week, just remember, they matter. And what do they need to be told? The kingdom can be here. We don't have to wait for heaven. The kingdom can be here if we build it together. The greatest thing about church is that we can look at people sitting beside us and see that there's others who agree with us. That's all church really does, is it allows us to relax with people who have the same opinion. But we don't live here. We're only refreshed here. The job now is to get on the road, whether it's proverbial or physical, get on the road and be Jesus to the people around. Because this doesn't matter. As beautiful as it is, as many memories as it is, this does not matter. What matters is what you're going to do when you leave this place today, who you're going to talk to, who you're going to celebrate with, what myth of Christianity are you going to debunk? Number one I'd go after is that we're hateful people, because we're not. Who are you going to be that when someone leaves your presence, they're going to say, wow, I think I just touched God. Be that person, because that's who we're called to be. Don't worry about what society tells you is important. Be the person who can be a disciple, because that's who we are.